Hey everyone, welcome back to the Bimmer Barn. In today's episode, we're going to be servicing the two most common leaks on the M54 platform, and that is going to be the valve cover gasket and the oil filter stand gasket. These are both common problems, and we're going to be servicing them on my 2005 E46 Wagon. Now, if you enjoy this sort of content, please drop a like down below because it would help YouTube promote my videos, and that helps me create better content for you guys. So with that being said, let's get straight into today's video. So, to pull off this beautiful valve cover, you're going to first need to get the cabin filter housing off. You've got three twisty screws here, and then you're going to pull off the cabin filter itself, and then your upper housing is going to be held in by 4 T30 bolts. Mine only has 2, and I already loosened them, so I just pulled them off here by hand, but you'll probably have to use an extension and a ratchet. So next up, we're going to remove the valve cover. This has two 10mm nuts, and then you need to pull off the oil cap, and then you'll be able to get the cover out, and then put your oil cap back on. Now we need to get the secondary air pump motor out of the way. This is held in by 3 10mm bolts. You're going to go ahead and loosen those up. And then you're going to want to loosen the hose clamp that holds to the motor, and then finally the electrical connector at the bottom. You can see that it's held on by 3 rubber bushings, and all 3 of them are broken on mine. Now, while I had this out, I also took the opportunity, since it had some surface rust, to grind it down, and then I used this rust reformer spray from Rust-Oleum. It does a great job of converting the rust, I guess, or sealing up the metal, and it gives this awesome coating to the metal. So we replaced the rubber bushings, and it looks really stealth afterwards. So moving back to the valve cover, you're going to need to remove the ignition coil harness. It's kind of held in by a couple clips along the bottom and then attached to each of the coils. And then you're also going to want to remove the ground strap, and then finally get that thing out of the way. Next up, we're going to remove all of the ignition coils, and this is going to be an opportune time to do your spark plugs, which we're going to be doing after we get the valve cover replaced. But now we're going to remove the oxygen sensor wires and the connectors. These are just going to give us a little bit of room, and then they have to stay on the bottom here while the valve cover comes up. So we're going to move these cables out of the way, tuck them down here by the firewall, and that's going to give us room so that when we put the valve cover back on, we're not going to risk pinching those wires. So the valve cover is held in by a bunch of 10mm screws, and these things are all over the place, so I'm just showing you them here. And I'm going to use a 10mm on a wobble socket with an extension, and that's going to give me plenty of access to all of these. So when you get all the bolts off, you're probably going to need to use a pry bar to loosen up the valve cover. Be really gentle because the valve cover is made out of plastic. You don't want to crack it, but just break it loose and slowly wobble it until it comes free on its own. And then you can see here just how dirty and how the oil was escaping from underneath the valve cover. Now this is also a great time to clean where all that oil was leaking and seeping out before. So the headers have these little heat shields that keeps the heat from coming up to the engine bay, and they're just covered in oil. So I used the last of a can of brake cleaner here, soaked them real good, and then we got a microfiber to clean off the valve cover and the head where those two mating surfaces are going to meet, and that way we've got a really clean surface to install our valve cover. So it slides on pretty easily, I have to say. You're gonna load up with all of your 10mm screws, and then you can go ahead and torque them down. These things just need to be hand snug. Don't torque them down anything past that. And like I said, now would be a great time to replace your spark plugs, so that's what we're going to go ahead and do last. So to remove the oil filter stand, you're going to first have to pull off the alternator, and that means disconnecting your battery. So go ahead and do that first. And then the alternator is held in by a couple of 16mm bolts, and that just pulls right off. Remember to get the electrical connectors on the back end. And then you should also remove the power steering reservoir. This is just held in by a couple of 13mm bolts. And now you can see the 6 13mm bolts that hold the oil filter stand on. They're pretty easy to see here. And actually, to make our lives just a little bit easier, I'm going to pull off the hydraulic belt tensioner assembly. We had just replaced this in a previous episode on this build, so go ahead and check that video out if you haven't seen it. But it's going to keep a little bit of weight off of this assembly, make it easier to pull out of the car. And you know, you don't need to pull it off, but I went ahead and did so anyways. Now you do need to remove the power steering pump. This is held in by a couple of 13mm bolts from the front side, and then there's one more 13mm that's kind of hard to see and reach from the back side, and it's literally pointed up. You can kind of see the screw hole for it here. But once you've got the power steering pump loose, you can just dangle it aside, and that's going to give you as much clearance as you need to pull out the oil filter stand. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to remove the electrical connector for the oil pressure switch, and then we're also going to pull off the oil filter because that doesn't need to be in there, and that's going to help some of the oil drain from the housing back into the motor so we don't even lose that much oil when we do this job. Now the last thing that you need to worry about is the Vanos pressure line right here. That's held in by a banjo bolt. Go ahead and break that free, move the line out of the way, and I like to put the banjo bolt back in so that it stays there in the meantime. Now you do want to keep track of where these bolts go because they are different lengths. They do get longer along the top, so just keep that in mind and try to label them or put them in a certain order to the side as you remove them. So it looks like mines have been leaking slowly for a while. You can see that there's caked up oil and dirt on the side of the motor right beside and behind the housing, and that tells us that the gasket is bad, and that is why we're replacing it. When you're reinstalling the oil filter housing, do make note that there is an alignment dowel on the block of the motor, and so you don't want to compress this thing on or try to torque it down to the motor until it's 100% aligned on the block. So make sure that that is correct, and then you can start to reinstall your bolts. The book tells us that the oil filter stand uses 22 Newton meters of torque, and the banjo bolt for the Vanos pressure line uses 40 Newton meters. So that's going to conclude today's video. We successfully replaced both of the gaskets on the motor, and we also got to repaint the secondary air pump bracket so it looks a little more stealth in the engine bay, and we serviced the spark plugs as well, which is really easy to do when you're doing the valve cover gasket. So if you enjoyed today's video, please drop a like down below, comment if you have any helpful tips or questions about the job, and be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. I hope everyone has an awesome day, and we'll see you in the next video.